What's the date?
Today's
The 10th?
No, today's the 8th, isn't it?
8th?
yeah.
Well, we'll see. We may finish this lesson today, and then we'll probably have 2 more weeks in Ezekiel, either the last week in September or the first in October, and then we'll start something new. Becky put together a sign-up sheet. So it's up here. This is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, so that'll be the next Sunday school class. And the book, if you want to order it, that way we'll all kind of have the same page number and everything. If you already got your own copy, that's fine. But if you don't have a copy and you want to order it, go ahead and sign up that. That's what we'll start. So I generally try to have a class on church history, and then one like Ezekiel that's on a specific book of the Bible, and then something more topical. So as many of you know, Viktor Frankl is a Holocaust survivor from World War II. He's a famous psychologist, and that book was a national bestseller. It's an excellent, excellent book. And it talks about his experiences in the concentration camp in World War II, and then also his own approach to psychotherapy based on, I think I said this last week, but within the major schools of psychology, one of the big questions is, what is the fundamental motive in human life? Like if you're a Freudian psychologist, it's the pleasure principle. For Viktor Frankl, it's the search for meaning or purpose. And so he bases his psychotherapy on that. I think it's an excellent book. So there's a sign-up sheet for that.
It's one of the 10, I think, Dennis Prager said it's one of the 10 books that he thinks everybody should read.
Who said that?
Dennis Prager. Some point in their life.
Okay. A lot of you have heard of Dennis Prager. He feels it's one of the 10 books everybody should read in their life. Yeah?
I'm more interested in the top 10 books that David Ladd was suggesting.
Yeah. Well, Homer's Iliad is up there. I mean, the Odyssey, yeah.
Yeah, no, forget it. No, never track it. The Odyssey.
Did Michael ever become a Christian?
No, he remained Jewish. His wife was a Roman Catholic. And so they both were broadly religious people. And I don't know that he ever became explicitly Christian. But his Jewish faith became very important to him. And his wife's Roman Catholic faith was important to her. And at any rate, he believed that a religious outlook on life was a very, very important part of achieving purpose. And psychologists always struggle with that. Jordan Peterson is a big name these days, and people are wrestling with whether he's not really a Christian. But he's another example. Now, his wife is converted to Roman Catholicism, as has his daughter. But like a lot of intellectuals and psychologists, he has a hard time allowing himself to be pigeonholed. He doesn't like that. Which is important, because actually if he did allow that, that would greatly reduce the audience of people that he speaks to. Part of the reason why he's so popular is that he doesn't let anybody know exactly what it is he believes about some of these issues. So that's Dr. Jordan Peterson. Everybody heard of him? Okay, I mean, I know you're a big fan, and you're not a big fan. I just said that to aggravate you, So we're looking at Ezekiel. We're coming down toward the end here. Chapters 33 to 37. Maybe I'll get through these chapters if I can. 586 to 585 BC. During these years, the first 7 years of Ezekiel's ministry have been vindicated. He has preached endlessly that Jerusalem will fall. Everybody thought he was full of it. And now what he has predicted has come to pass. We saw last week that this has created a little bit of a challenge for him because he's become kind of people come to his house almost like he's a zoo animal just to see what he's going to do next. In these final chapters, however, on page 75, the first two promises, now that Jerusalem has fallen, is promise of a future king and a future land. In the last week, we spent pretty much, I think, half or more of the class in talking about the king. Ezekiel says that God will provide Israel with good shepherds. Now, this is incredibly important in the ministry of Jesus in the New Testament. Most of us know that in the Gospel of John, Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. And the shepherd is the classical image of the good king. Because a shepherd rules, on the one hand, his sheep, and on the other hand, a shepherd cares for them. So it's not just about power or controlling others, but doing what is right for them. So today I'm going to pick up over on page 77. I think there's only one line at the bottom. The fall of Edom and the restoration of Israel. We already mentioned that the Edomites were close relatives of the Israelites. You've all probably heard the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob becomes the father of the Israelites, and Esau becomes the father of the Edomites. And for that reason, the fact that Edom betrayed Israel in her final days was significant. When Nebuchadnezzar brought the army over, Judah looked for help from various nations, and Edom didn't stand with her, and she didn't stand against her. She just kind of stood back and said, we're not going to get involved. But secretly, she was prepared to assist the enemy when the day came. And there's probably something of that in... she was going to take whichever side seemed to be winning. Anybody know anybody like that? Who you don't entirely trust? You feel like, well, whatever side seems to be winning, that's the one that they're going to take. You might have a person at your job who is like that. They're just opportunists. They're just opportunists. So in the season when faithfulness was called for, Edom didn't do anything. So top of page 78, Ezekiel's second oracle promises to renew what he calls the mountains of Israel, the land. But first, Yahweh is going to destroy Mount Seir. So that is, the Edomites will be judged, and then Judah will be restored. And from this point forward, Edom becomes a kind of symbol for what God will do with the wicked. Many of you know that the Old Testament doesn't really speak about heaven or hell. Those aren't really issues that come up in the Old Testament. However, much of the imagery that we associate with hell in the New Testament comes from prophecies connected with Edom. Fire, sulfur, smoke going up forever and ever. So Ezekiel is one of the first prophets to use Edom in this capacity. I'm going to pick up in chapter 35, verse 1, and we'll just read what Ezekiel says here. And I'll read up through the 15th verse. Ezekiel chapter 35, 1 to 15. The word of Yahweh came to me, Son of man, set your face against Mount Seir, that's the mountain of Edom. Prophesy against it and say to it, thus says Adonai Yahweh, behold, I am against you, Mount Seir. I will stretch out my hand against you. I will make you a desolation and a waste. I will lay your cities to waste. You shall become a desolation, and you shall know that I am Yahweh, because you cherished perpetual enmity, so this hostility against Israel. Gave over the people of Israel to the power of the sword at the time of their calamity, at the time of their final punishment. Therefore, as I live, declares Adonai Yahweh, I will prepare you for blood. Blood shall pursue you. That language, blood shall pursue you, any of you Old Testament people want to say where that is taken from, where one brother murders another and the blood of the murdered brother chases them down. Sounds like the story of Cain and Abel.
I thought first Enoch.
No, it's not first Enoch. No. Cain and Abel. So Ezekiel's calling up this issue of brotherly enmity here. I will make Mount Seir a waste and a desolation. I will cut off from it all who come and go. I will fill the mountains with the slain. On your hills and in your valleys and in all your ravines, those slain with the sword shall fall. I will make you. This is significant. Verse 9, the ESV translates this a perpetual desolation. So have the idea of eternal destruction here. And so these passages about Edom in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel particularly, though, kind of become the basis for that. Because you said, these two nations, verse 10, these two countries shall be mine, so the Edomites are going to come and take over the land after the Israelites are booted out. We will take possession of them, although Yahweh was there. Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord God, I will deal with you according to the anger and envy you showed because of your hatred against them. And I will make myself known among them when I judge you, and you shall know that I am the Lord. I have heard all the revilings that you uttered against the mountains of Israel, saying, they are laid desolate, they are given to us to devour, and you magnified yourselves against me with your mouth, multiplied your words against me, and I heard it. So after the Israelites are kicked out of the land, the Edomites move in, basically, and there's this old sibling rivalry of Jacob taking the birthright from Esau and Esau wanting it back. Now, most of you know the story in the book of Genesis that Jacob and Esau are reconciled in the end. It's a very, very famous story, and it's a beautiful story. But with the Edomite people, it's still going on here. After the fall of Mount Seir comes the restoration then of Israel. But I want to stop a moment and see if there's any questions about Edom. So Edom betrayed Israel in the end, and she's going to be wiped out and made a desolation. I put it in the liturgy. All right.
Pastor Chad,
Yes.
this would be an example of a prophecy that was fulfilled?
That was what?
That was fulfilled?
Yes. I would say partially. It was fulfilled in the sense that when Nebuchadnezzar came back, the Edomites were significantly reduced. You can't say that their land was rendered a perpetual waste or that they ceased to exist, because by the time we get to the New Testament, King Herod is hired by the Roman government to serve as king over Judah, and he's an Edomite. So the Edomite people were not obliterated, and the presence in the land was not completely wiped out. But they did at this point cease to be a powerful civilization. At this point, there's nothing in the archaeological record that makes them interesting. They don't have big cities, they don't have writing, they don't have a culture. They're just sort of hanging on through the centuries. So I would say that what Ezekiel says comes true, but he goes a little bit beyond history here by portraying Edom as utterly wiped out. And that's why a lot of times these passages about the Edomites become repurposed for descriptions of what God will do with the godless at the end of all time. As I mentioned, there's really no discussion of heaven or hell in the Old Testament. But passages like this sound an awful lot like it. So you can sort of see the dogma developing over time. That's as close as I would get. But the Edomites are done as far as being political players in the ancient world. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, Ezekiel's tricky because some of what he says has to do with the history of his own time, but he passes very, very quickly into these sort of eternal issues, and it's not always easy to know where he crosses that line, as we'll probably see today when we get past the Edom passage. Now I'm going to read from the lesson here on page 78 because I kind of translated some of this and then I sliced it up a little bit. Last full paragraph on page 78. Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of Yahweh. Because the enemy said of you, Aha! And the ancient heights have become our possession. Precisely because they made you desolate and crushed you from all sides, so that you became the possession of the rest of the nations. You became the talk and evil gossip of the people. Surely I have spoken in my hot jealousy against the rest of the nations and against Edom. Note there how Edom and the rest of the nations are kind of lumped together there. Edom becomes a kind of representative for the nations that are against Israel, who gave my land to themselves as a possession with wholehearted joy, utter contempt, that they might make its pasture lands a prey. Behold, I swear that the nations that are all around you shall themselves suffer reproach. But you, O mountains of Israel, shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they will soon come home. Soon come home. I am for you. I will turn to you. You shall be tilled and sown. I will multiply people on you. The whole house of Israel, all of it. The cities shall be inhabited, the waste places rebuilt, and I will multiply on you man and beast, and they shall multiply and be fruitful. I will cause you to be inhabited as in former times, and do more good to you than before, and then you will know that I am Yahweh. Okay. So, the promise of a good shepherd, the promise of the destruction of Edom and the restoration of Israel. That is what Ezekiel has to say. Now on page 79 is where he really starts to say some things that are unexpected. We would know from the Old Testament that they're going to get a good king, they're going to get new land, but now on page 79 he begins to move into some territory that the New Testament writers hone in on quite a bit. Because even if the king is good, and even if the land is good, what of the people? I could say the same thing about the school where I teach. Even if we get the best teachers in the world, even if we get the best facilities, what of the students? Who are we inviting into this institution that we have to deal with here? All throughout Ezekiel's career, he said the people of Israel had profaned God's name, and that Yahweh's point was to vindicate his holiness. That's a big feature of Ezekiel, and it's not a popular feature. It almost sounds like Yahweh is going to vindicate his holiness as a kind of revenge against the people of Israel. But here, it's a little bit different, and this is the first time in the book of Ezekiel I find it. And I'm trying to think of a way I would put it. All throughout Ezekiel up to this point, Ezekiel's point has been that Yahweh is going to say, I was right all along. Now, however, he strikes a somewhat different note in this chapter. When the house of Israel lived in their own land, they defiled it by their ways, so I poured out my wrath on them and scattered them among the nations. This is chapter 36. Therefore, Son of Man, say to the house of Israel, thus says Adonai Yahweh, here he goes again, it is not for your sake that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name. There's Yahweh again saying, this isn't about you. But however, chapter 36, verse 23, the nations will know that I am Yahweh when, here's the key phrase, through you I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. Now that's an important shift in the whole book. Because what Yahweh is going to do is by making the people of Israel holy, through them, he will vindicate his name. And I draw attention to that because that hasn't been clear at any point in this book. All throughout the book, it's mostly Yahweh versus the people, Yahweh versus the people. But now at this particular point, he is going to somehow make his people holy, and when that happens, the nations will see that he is Yahweh. I got a little footnote here on ritual versus moral holiness, and I don't know how deep to go into this before I get into the next section, but by holiness here, Yahweh is definitely referring to moral holiness. So if you read the Old Testament, there's all these different kinds of rules that are sort of ritually based. Before you go to the temple, you should wash with water. You should only eat certain kinds of meat. And things of that nature. They don't appear to be moral issues. They appear to be issues of ritual propriety. It's difficult to come up with examples, but when my sons were little, she wouldn't let them track mud into the house. It wasn't a moral issue. It was an issue of cleanliness. But she still wouldn't do it. You know, the kids would be outside playing all day. They hadn't done anything morally wrong, but they were covered in dirt. And they would come walking into the house like, here I am. And Becky would say, no, you're not. You go out there, turn on the hose, and hose yourself down before you come in, then you can take a shower. So, there's a number of issues in the Old Testament that are like that. They're not moral issues. The Israelites have to hunt. They have to hunt game. They have to have sexual relations and produce children. They have to eat different kinds of food. They have to engage in the world out there that is very, very messy. And there's nothing wrong with that, but when they come to temple, they need to wash and be clean. So they haven't done anything wrong, so that's an issue of ritual holiness. But here Ezekiel is talking about moral holiness. And the main issues in moral holiness are idolatry, adultery, and bloodshed. So those are moral issues. If the kids walk into the house covered in dirt, that's one thing. If they walk into the house covered in blood, that's another. Becky and I might both say, what have you been up to? So that becomes a moral issue. So here, when Ezekiel's talking about the transformation of God's people, he's primarily interested in the moral issue. Do they shed the blood of their fellow man? Do they take women who belong to other people? Do they steal? Do they commit adultery? And so that's where we get to the promise of a new heart, which is the next thing I'm going to read. But I want to see if there's any questions before I read that passage. Because this is an area where Christians wrestle a little bit. There's a lot of rules in the Old Testament. It's not always clear to Christians when they're reading the Old Testament which rules have moral force and which rules are part of the ritual lifestyle of the ancient Israelite people.
So in your example about ritual holiness,
Mm-hmm.
you're using an example that when the boys were young, you didn't want them tracking more than the house, but now they can.
No, they still can't. Now, if you read Leviticus, the book of Leviticus requires, like if a person commits bloodshed, they have to bring a sacrificial animal. That's for a moral transgression. But if a woman has a child, she also has to bring a sacrificial animal to the temple. Now, it's evident that by giving birth to a child, she hasn't committed any moral transgression. She's just given birth to a child. But the sacrifice still has to be brought. And so one of the things that modern readers have difficulty understanding is that some issues in the Old Testament code of behavior are moral issues, questions of right and wrong, and other issues are mostly questions of ritual propriety, what is appropriate in connection with the temple.
This is a question I don't know what the answer would be, but aren't the moral or aren't the ritual stuff is there to teach us moral stuff, isn't it, or not? I mean, aren't we supposed to get? Aren't we supposed to?
That's a good question. I mean, you might ask, what is the ritual stuff there for then?
I mean, because, like, you know, the priests doing their thing and wearing the beads and doing this, and that's all pointing towards who God is, who we are. Right? I mean, we're supposed to get something from that ritual stuff that's a moral lesson, isn't it, or no?
Well, some of them are. So some rituals, like putting scripture verses, say, on the doorposts or on the tassels, those are rituals. It's not like if you failed to do that, you would be guilty of some moral transgression, but it's there to teach you a lesson. And so some of the rituals are there for a moral purpose. Other rituals are just basically to keep anything associated with death away from Yahweh's sanctuary. And the idea there is that Yahweh is the source of life. His sanctuary has to be kept pure from all the sources of death. That's a very, very ancient idea. But if you go to the New Testament, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, look at the miracles that Jesus performs. They're all connected with the rituals. He raises the dead. He heals the leper. He heals the woman who has bleeding for several different kinds of, for many, many years. All of that stuff's right out of the book of Leviticus. No people who he heals in those regard had done anything wrong. In fact, Jesus even says that. The Jews ask him, who sinned, this person or their father, that they have this problem? And Jesus says, nobody sinned. But this was done because one of the things that keeps us from our fellowship with God is not only our moral transgressions, but also our mortality. And I think sometimes we forget that in religious circles, that the gulf between us and God is partially because of the fact that we don't lead very good lifestyles. But that's not the whole of it. Some of it is just our animal nature. And God actually intends to conquer death and bring us into fellowship with him. And that conquering of death isn't something we could ever accomplish on our own, no matter how moral we were. And so some of the rituals have to do with that. Some of them are to teach a moral lesson, but some of them, and this is hard again for us to understand, have to do with the fact that God is immortal. We are mortal, and those two things in the ancient mind don't mix. And so a good deal of Jesus' ministry in the New Testament is just overcome mortality. We sort of take that for granted in Christian circles, but it's a very, very big issue. And it's certainly present in Ezekiel. It's relevant, actually, to what he's going to talk about in a little bit. He's going to get to the valley of dry bones, and I don't know, who wrote that song? Do you know who wrote it?
Tennessee Ernie Ford?
Was it Tennessee Ernie Ford wrote the Dry Bones song?
I don't know.
I don't know. That's like, I think he sang it. Yeah. The first time I ever heard it was on the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman. I think they were playing that back in the 80s or something. Well, I got two passages to look at today, and then we're done. On page 79, the promise of a new heart. So this has to do with the moral issue. The reason why Yahweh had to leave the sanctuary and the reason why everything fell apart for Israel is because they were rotten to the core. So we have this passage, chapter 36, verse 24. I will take you from the nations, gather you from all the countries, and bring you into your own land. Okay, so they're there. They've got a new king. Now what? I will sprinkle clean water on you. There's that ritual purity. And you shall be clean from all your uncleanliness. And from all your idols I will cleanse you. So they're going to stop worshiping things other than God, which is still a problem in the world today. People are, whether they realize it or not, they worship things. Whatever they give their time, energy, and money to and sacrifice everything for, that's what you worship. The only thing I like about ancient peoples is that they knew what they were doing. When they worshiped something, they knew they were worshiping it, whereas a lot of modern people, they say, well, I don't worship anything. And it's like, yes, you do. Everybody worships something. There's something in your life that you will sacrifice everything else for. That's your God. That is your God. And you can say, well, your God is this, and you can say, well, your God is that, but when it comes down to it, your God, the power that you worship, is the thing that you give all that you have for. And so that's what Ezekiel's talking about here. And then he says, I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And that's important because we all worship and pursue other things, but we feel helpless. Yeah, I guess I worship wealth, or I guess I worship pleasure, or I guess I worship my own freedom, but I can't help it. I'm just in love with those things, and what can I do? And so Ezekiel is saying that Yahweh will give his people a new heart. I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to obey my rules. And you shall dwell in the land that I gave your fathers. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. Then everyone who passes by will say, the land, top of page 80, that was once desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and they shall know that I am Yahweh. So here Ezekiel is channeling some stuff we find in Deuteronomy. We also find it in Jeremiah. I should say that the heart in ancient literature does not refer to the emotions. In fact, we took the kids last year on a field trip to the Detroit Institute of Arts. They had those canopic jars, where they mummify the Egyptian pharaohs, and then they take their organs out and put them in these jars. Yes? And that one's got like a falcon head and one's got another head. The heart, the Egyptians and the Hebrews both thought was the seat of thought. Now, when we think of the seat of thought, we think of the brain, the gray matter up there. But whenever you're reading in the New Testament or the Old about the heart, it refers to thinking. And by thinking, they're not talking about like solving math problems. They're talking about what are your goals or your intentions. Because as human beings, unlike the animal, we're not driven, shouldn't be driven, solely by our passions or feelings. We should be driven by thoughts, goals that we are pursuing. And so that's one of the distinctions of being a human being. Unlike the animal, I don't have to do something just because it feels good. I can actually say no to pleasures if I think that there's a good outcome for me on the other end of that. Likewise, I don't have to not do things because they're painful. I can say yes to pains and difficulties if I think they're good for me. And so Aristotle observes this, one of the distinctions of human beings is that he says they're rational. But by saying they're rational, Aristotle means that they're not bound, governed, controlled by their emotions. When people are out there exercising and causing themselves all kinds of pain, why do they do it? They think it's good for them. And if people are surrounded by all kinds of pleasures that they could very well chase down, but they say no, why don't they do it? Well, they don't do it because they think that saying no to those things is good for them. And so when Ezekiel here is talking about a new heart, he's talking about a new intention, a new goal that people are going to pursue that will allow them to say no to pleasures and yes to sufferings and to pursue a higher form of life. Well, I'll stop there because the word heart, we use the word heart as a good translation in a lot of these texts, but I think it confuses most readers because most people think it has to do with feelings or emotions. All right. This passage from Jeremiah on page 80 is very famous. And Jeremiah is still living while Ezekiel's writing this. So the two of them could have compared notes. The days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was a husband to them. But this is the covenant I will make with them. And here, Jeremiah is saying the same thing that Ezekiel is saying. I will put my law within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. I'm trying to think of a good word for that, but psychologists call it internalization. What happens when you internalize something and it ceases to be a rule that comes at you from the outside? Will you do it even if somebody doesn't make you do it?
Yeah.
Now, I have a memory. You just reminded me of something. I won't say what age I was, but when I was really, really young, I didn't like to take showers. And I wouldn't take a shower unless an adult made me take a shower. And I remember my cousin Marcus looking at me one day with kind of funny grin on his face saying, "You don't like to take showers?" And I suddenly felt the shame of my stupidity at that point. I don't know how old I was, but it dawned on me for the first time that taking a shower is in itself a desirable thing, and that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to go on being smelly and unclean. And we all have stages like that in our life, whether it's brushing our teeth or taking a shower, where we no longer do it because some authority figure is imposing a rule on us from the outside. Does that make sense? And that happens in level. Taking a shower, that's for children. Learning is another one, though. I teach. Learning is another one. How many discovered at a certain point of their life that learning and growing in knowledge was desirable even if somebody didn't make you do it? But I had several of the older people go, "Uh-huh," and then I had several of the younger people go like that. So, okay, there it is. There it is. So some of you aren't there yet. You're like, the only time I ever study or learn anything is because somebody's cracking the whip at my feet and I don't have a choice. But, you reach a point in your life where you're like, I want to know more. I want to understand the world in which I live. And I'm going to do that whether somebody makes me or not. Well, what are some other examples? Anybody got any personal examples of something that the showering one's kind of embarrassing, but it's a simple one. Something that you learned and that you're like, I desire to do that now. It's not just...
It's like cleaning house. My mom told me one time, I'll never forget it. She said, "Peggy, you weren't born in a barn." It kind of stuck in my head, and so I've always tried to be tidy, clean, stuff like that.
But prior to that, you were happy living in a barn.
Oh, sure. What kid isn't?
So, cleaning your house,
It's like making your bed.
taking a shower, making your bed.
I made my bed myself. So maybe you need to shame me. I'm in the bottom.
You don't make your bed?
He hasn't reached that level. Exercise.
Now that I've not learned.
As you can see, I'm very, very good at it. No, not everybody learns the value of, but for some people, caring for their physical fitness, self-care, and it's a pleasure, and it's a joy to do it. Spiritual things, coming to church. When you're little, or you come to church because you have to, you don't want to go to church, the sermons, this, that, and the next thing. You can reach a point in your life when the things of God speak to you in a way that you want to pursue them. The spiritual things become desirable to you. But that takes maturity. Certainly for young men, work. When kids are growing up, nobody wants to work. Nobody wants to work. I remember Dad telling me, he's not here one day, he said, the day's going to come when you will live for your work. And I thought, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Because I was just a dumb kid. But I remember him saying that, and that's all Dad said. He said, the day's going to come when you will live for your work. And I thought, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And I just kind of walked off like the stupid kid I was. But here I am, 46, and I'm like, no, there's a lot of truth in that. How many men live for their work? And it's so much so that it's very hard to put it down. They have a hard time finding any other purpose that they can be satisfied with. So those are just examples. Ezekiel's talking about God and living for God, and that's at the highest level, that a human being can mature to the point where there's actually desiring after God. I think that's what he's talking about here. So that's interesting. I don't want to go into the valley of dry bones right away. I'll take a minute and a half, and I'll see if there's any comment, because we'll finish this lesson this week. We're going to end with that. And see if there's any comment about that. But the new heart thing, I think, is pretty important.
What, do you think this is a foreshadowing of the New Testament?
Yes.
You don't say it in the notes, by the way.
I don't say it in the notes because I like to... This stuff in Ezekiel is totally a foreshadowing of the New Testament. I will put my spirit within you. It's very difficult for Christians to read passages like that and not think about the gift of the Holy Spirit. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. It's very difficult to read that and not think of Paul's discussion of the rules of the Torah versus the gift of the Spirit, where we want to live out God's commands. It's not just that we do it, but there's a genuine desire to do the right thing. Even a desire to make sacrifice. Not last Sunday, the Sunday before, I preached about Paul and Silas in prison after being beaten, singing hymns. Who sings hymns when they've been beaten and punished? But they found joy. Why did they find joy? Because they were following the example of Christ. And that filled them with great joy, that's what they were doing. So these are powerful anticipations of the New Testament. I don't think Ezekiel realizes when he writes this exactly everything that he's writing. But he's writing, one of the beautiful things about the prophets is they write beyond their own comprehension. I definitely think that's going on. And in the Valley of Dry Bones, chapter 37, he really goes even further. This passage is widely regarded as one of the few references to the resurrection in the Old Testament. Now, if you read the Old Testament, one of the things that immediately strikes you is there's very little notion of the afterlife. What in Christian circles is like the point of the whole thing, that you get to live forever, is hardly anywhere. But there are passages where it appears, and this is certainly one of them. In this vision, Yahweh takes Ezekiel to the scene of a great battle. So I think Tolkien's Return of the King, the Dead Marshes, is sort of a hybrid of J.R.R. Tolkien's reading of Ezekiel, where he goes to a great battle scene. And he also fought in World War I, where a lot of men fell into the trenches and were soaked in water, and you could see them lying under the water. So this plain is filled with the bones of people who've died in battle. And remember, Jerusalem's been taken. The hand of Yahweh was upon me. He brought me out in the spirit of Yahweh and set me down in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me around among them. Behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry. He said, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Adonai Yahweh, you know, which is a good answer. I think I would have said, I don't think so. Or if I was teaching logic class, I would have said something like, it is highly improbable. The slain appear to be the people of Israel, and the question is whether they can live again. And one of the issues that's here, and then I'll read the passage, is the death of the good. One of the issues in life that comes up in the exile is that many people died because they were wicked, but not everybody who died was wicked. In other words, if justice is real, if right and wrong is real, then where, unless it's like Billy Joel says, the good die young, when do the righteous receive their reward? They don't always receive it in this life. Now, if you read the book of Proverbs, it sounds like the righteous thrive in this life, and the wicked, it doesn't go well for them in this life. But most of us know that that's not always how it goes. Sometimes a righteous person dies, and the Psalms say a wicked person prospers in their wickedness. And so the question comes, well, when does this happen? He said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says Adonai Yahweh to these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews upon you, and cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. So I, Ezekiel, prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a sound, sort of cinematography here, a rattling. You come in at Becky showed up at like the dramatic moment. We're doing dry bones here. The bones came together, bone to its bone, and I looked, and behold, there were sinews on them. Flesh had come upon them, skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. So it's sort of not decomposition, but recomposition. And then he said, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy to the breath, son of man, and say to the breath, thus says Adonai Yahweh, come from, top of page 81, the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, an exceedingly great army. Now I mention here, this is clearly on one level a metaphor for the hopelessness of Israel's situation, and God will raise up his people again. But it includes the dead as well as the living, and this is one of the few passages in the Old Testament that's interpreted as the resurrection of the dead. He said to me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off. Prophesy and say to them, thus says Adonai Yahweh, I will open your graves, raise you from your graves, I will bring you into the land of Israel, and you shall know that I am Yahweh when I open your graves and raise you up from your graves, O my people. And I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you in your own land, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. I have spoken, and I will do it. This was regarded by Jews as a literal resurrection of the dead. I mentioned that here in passage. And actually, if you read the New Testament closely, you'll observe that the Sadducees do not believe there's a resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees do, and this passage was one of the most important passages for the Pharisees. The Sadducees just booted it out of the canon. They didn't think that Ezekiel was part of the Bible. Matthew 27, when Jesus dies, Matthew's the only one of the four Gospels. What does he say happens to the saints living in the environs of Jerusalem? They come out of there graves. Many people don't quite know what to do with that passage, but that resonates with this from Ezekiel. And the church fathers certainly believed that this has to do with the resurrection of the dead. Does Pastor Chad think it has to do with the resurrection of the dead? I do. So I take a very traditional view on that one. There's one passage here, another in Job, some scattered throughout Isaiah and the other prophets. But, it's surprising for us as Christians to think that the afterlife is such a radical view, but it is a radical view. Most ancient peoples didn't believe in it. Even Jews didn't believe in it. Most people thought dead is dead. And it took many, many centuries for the idea that death is not the end to take hold. And this is one of the passages where that happens. I'm a little past time, so I'd say we're almost out of time. We're going to have a new lesson next week. But before we go and grab a bite to eat and stave off the day of our own death, anybody got any final questions or comments about this one? This is a good passage. Next week, I got a new lesson for you. There's going to be a final battle between good and evil, Gog and Magog. And then Ezekiel's going to discuss the temple and a sort of utopian vision of the future of the universe. And then he's done. So I'll let you go. Enjoy the weather. Oh.